There are places on Earth where humans are not supposed to go, not because they're difficult to reach, but because something about them feels wrong. Deep inside sealed caves, hidden within restricted military zones, or buried in landscapes untouched for thousands of years. People have found objects that should not exist, not ancient tools, not natural formations, but structures, machines, and artifacts that don't match anything we understand about history, science, or human capability. Some of them appear far too advanced for their time. Others were discovered in locations so inaccessible that simply reaching them should have been impossible. And yet they are there, documented, photographed, studied, but never fully explained. What you're about to see are 7 of the most disturbing discoveries ever found in places where no one was meant to look. Objects that challenge everything we think we know about our world, and raise a much darker question. What if these places were never meant to be found at all? For decades, explorers, scientists, and even ordinary people have stumbled upon discoveries that defy logic. At first glance, some of these objects appear to be nothing more than unusual formations or remnants of forgotten civilizations. But the deeper they are analyzed, the more unsettling they become. Because they don't just raise questions about where they were found. They raise questions about how they got there. In some cases, the surrounding environment makes construction nearly impossible. No access routes, no signs of transportation, no evidence of human activity nearby. In others, the materials themselves don't match anything naturally found in the region, as if they were brought from somewhere else, or built using knowledge we no longer possess. And perhaps the most disturbing detail of all, many of these discoveries were never meant to be public. Some were quietly documented and then sealed off. Others were suddenly restricted with access permanently denied. And a few simply disappeared from official records altogether. But fragments of information still remain. Images, reports, accounts from those who saw them before they were hidden. And when you put all of it together, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that suggests these are not isolated anomalies, but something far more deliberate. So the question is no longer just what are these objects? The real question is, why were they found in places no one was ever supposed to reach? High in a remote mountain range, far beyond any marked trail, where oxygen is thin and temperatures can drop without warning. A team of climbers made a discovery they were never supposed to find. It wasn't visible from a distance. There were no signs, no structures, nothing unusual, until they got closer. Carved directly into the rock, perfectly aligned with the natural surface of the mountain, was what appeared to be a door. Not a cave opening, not a crack. A door. Flat, smooth, vertical, with edges so precise, it looked as if it had been cut using modern tools. But that alone wasn't the disturbing part, because when they examined it more closely, they realized something that made even experienced climbers step back. There was no path leading to it, no signs of construction, no debris, no tool marks scattered around. Nothing. Just a perfectly shaped entrance, placed in a location where building anything should have been impossible. And then came the detail that changed everything. At the center of the surface, there were markings, not random scratches, not erosion, symbols, faint, geometric, and unlike any known language officially recognized, the climbers took photos, recorded videos, and attempted to report the discovery. But shortly after, access to the area was suddenly restricted. The location was classified, and according to multiple accounts, anyone who tried to return was turned away. No explanation, no public statement, just silence. Which raises a question that still hasn't been answered. If it was just a natural formation, why make sure no one could ever see it again? In one of the most remote and inhospitable regions on Earth, where temperatures remain far below freezing and the landscape is buried under kilometers of ancient ice, a scientific drilling operation made a discovery that was never supposed to be part of the mission. The objective was simple: extract ice cores to study Earth's climate history. Layer by layer, the ice preserves a timeline stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. But as the drill descended deeper than expected, something unusual interrupted the process. The resistance changed. At first, The team assumed they had reached a denser ice layer or possibly embedded rock, but the vibration patterns didn't match anything natural. The drill encountered something solid, but structured. When they finally managed to extract part of what was blocking the drill, the initial confusion quickly turned into something else entirely. What emerged from beneath the ice was not rock. It was metal, dark, smooth, and unlike any known alloy typically used in modern engineering. The fragment showed no signs of corrosion, despite being buried under extreme conditions for what appeared to be an immense period of time. Its surface reflected light in a way that suggested precision manufacturing, not natural formation. That alone would have been extraordinary. But the real anomaly became clear only after further examination. The fragment wasn't just a piece of metal. It was part of something larger. Patterns along its edges indicated that it belonged to a structured system, something mechanical. Internal grooves, symmetrical channels, and layered components hinted at a level of complexity that raised immediate concern among the researchers. Because according to everything we understand about that environment, nothing like that should exist there. The depth at which it was found suggested that whatever it belonged to had been buried long before recorded human history. And yet, the design appeared advanced, far beyond anything primitive or ancient. The team attempted to continue drilling, hoping to uncover more of the structure. But shortly after the discovery, the operation was abruptly halted. Officially, the explanation cited equipment instability and environmental risk. Unofficially, several members of the team later claimed that the decision came from higher authorities, and that all samples were immediately secured and removed from the site. No further excavation was allowed. The project was quietly redirected, and the data related to that specific depth was never fully released. To this day, no public documentation provides a clear explanation for what was found beneath that ice, which leaves a question that becomes more unsettling the longer you think about it. If that object was truly part of a machine, what was it doing there? Buried under layers of ice that formed long before modern civilization even existed, in a remote coastal region where steep cliffs meet violent ocean waves, there is a cave that remained hidden for centuries. Its entrance is only visible during extremely low tides, and even then, reaching it requires navigating sharp rocks and unpredictable currents. For most of history, it was considered completely inaccessible. But after a rare geological shift exposed more of the shoreline, a small group of explorers managed to enter the cave for the first time in recorded history. What they found inside was not what anyone expected. The cave itself showed no signs of prior human activity, no footprints, no tools, no markings on the walls. The air felt heavy, undisturbed, as if nothing had entered that space for an incredibly long time. But as they moved deeper into the darkness, their lights revealed something at the center of the chamber that immediately stopped them. Resting on the ground, perfectly still and completely isolated from its surroundings, was a sphere. A stone sphere. At first, that might not seem unusual. Natural formations can sometimes create rounded shapes. But this was different. The surface was almost perfectly smooth, with a symmetry that felt unnatural, as if it had been shaped with extreme precision. There were no cracks, no irregularities, no signs of erosion that would typically appear over time. It looked intentional. And yet, that wasn't the most disturbing part. When they began to examine it more closely, they noticed faint patterns running across its surface. Not carved deeply, but embedded subtly, forming a network of lines that seemed too organized to be random. Some described them as geometric. Others said they resembled a kind of mapping, like a system or design that served a purpose no one could identify. The explorers documented everything: photos, measurements, detailed observations. But something else began to happen inside that cave. The deeper they stayed, the more they reported a strange sensation. Not fear exactly, but discomfort, a pressure that wasn't physical, yet impossible to ignore. Some claimed that sound behaved differently near the sphere, as if it absorbed or distorted the echoes within the chamber. One of them later described the experience in a way that stood out. It didn't feel like we had found something. It felt like we had entered a place where something was already waiting. After they left the cave, Access to the area quickly became restricted. Local authorities cited safety concerns due to unstable terrain, but no further exploration was permitted. Attempts to revisit the site were blocked, and over time, information about the discovery became increasingly difficult to verify. Today, there are no official studies available about that sphere. No confirmed analysis, no explanation, no classification, just a handful of accounts, and a question that continues to echo long after the cave was sealed again. If it was just a natural formation, why did everyone who stood near it feel like they weren't alone? There are places on Earth that do not appear on maps the way others do. Areas where access is limited, monitored, and in some cases, completely denied without explanation. Locations officially labeled as restricted, but rarely described in detail. It was near one of these zones in a remote desert region that a civilian survey team made a discovery they were never supposed to encounter. The team had been contracted to conduct routine geological analysis along the outer perimeter of a restricted military area. Their work was straightforward: mapping terrain, collecting samples, documenting surface anomalies. Nothing unusual had been reported in that region before, until one of their scanning devices detected something beneath the sand. At first, it appeared to be a density irregularity, something buried at a depth that didn't match the surrounding composition. Assuming it might be rock or debris, they adjusted their equipment to get a clearer reading. What they found didn't make sense. The signal reflected a shape that was too precise to be natural. Straight lines, defined angles, a structure. Curiosity pushed them further. Using limited excavation tools, they carefully removed layers of sand from the surface. It didn't take long before the outline began to emerge. What they uncovered was part of a geometric formation. Flat panels connected at exact angles, forming what appeared to be the corner of a much larger object buried beneath the desert. The material was unlike anything they had seen before. It wasn't metal, at least not in the traditional sense. It didn't corrode, didn't chip easily, and when struck lightly, it produced a dull, contained resonance, as if the structure absorbed the energy rather than dispersing it. There were no seams, no bolts, no visible methods of assembly. Just smooth, uninterrupted surfaces meeting with impossible precision. The team documented everything: photos, scans, coordinates. But before they could continue the excavation, they were approached. According to later accounts, multiple vehicles arrived from inside the restricted zone. Armed personnel secured the area within minutes. The team was instructed to step away from the site immediately, and all equipment was confiscated for review. No explanation was given, no acknowledgement of what had been found. The location was sealed off entirely, and within days, satellite imagery of the area appeared to have been altered or obscured. The team members were later required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Most of them never spoke publicly about the incident again, but one detail, mentioned in a fragmented account years later, continues to raise questions. Before they were removed from the site, one of the researchers reportedly asked a simple question: "What exactly is this structure?" The response he received was short and carefully chosen: "You weren't supposed to find it." In an isolated excavation site, far from any major city and surrounded by terrain that has remained largely untouched for thousands of years, a team of archaeologists was conducting what was supposed to be a routine dig. The region had already yielded fragments of ancient pottery and basic tools. Nothing unusual for a site believed to date back several thousand years. Everything pointed to a standard archaeological timeline. Layer by layer, the team carefully removed soil, documenting each stage with precision. In archaeology, depth matters. The deeper you go, the older the material becomes. It's a rule so consistent that entire historical models are built on it. But at a certain depth, something didn't follow that rule. One of the researchers uncovered a small, solid object embedded within a compact layer of sediment that had not been disturbed for an extremely long time. At first glance, it didn't match anything they had been finding so far. It was too refined, too precise. When they cleaned it carefully, the shape became clearer, and with it, the confusion. The object appeared to be manufactured, not carved, not shaped by hand, but engineered. Its surface was smooth, almost polished, with edges that aligned in a way that suggested deliberate design. There were repeating patterns across its structure, symmetrical and consistent, as if it had been produced using a controlled process. And yet, the layer it came from told a completely different story. Based on the depth and surrounding material, the object should have been at least several thousand years old. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that its design didn't resemble anything from that period. In fact, some elements of its structure looked more consistent with modern fabrication techniques than anything known from ancient civilizations. Certain details suggested precision machining, something that should not exist in that timeline. The team initially assumed contamination. Perhaps the layer had been disturbed at some point, or the object had somehow entered from a higher level. But after further analysis, that explanation became harder to support. The surrounding sediment was intact, undisturbed. There were no signs of intrusion, no tunnels, no fractures that would allow something newer to pass through. It had been there the entire time, which led to a possibility that no one wanted to say out loud. If the object truly belonged to that layer, then it meant that something far more advanced than we currently understand existed long before it should have. The artifact was sent for further analysis, but shortly after, access to the excavation site was restricted. The project was reassigned, and official documentation became increasingly limited. Today, references to that object are difficult to verify. Some reports describe it as a misinterpretation, others suggest it was removed from context, but none of them fully explain the one detail that started it all. How does a manufactured object end up buried in a layer of earth that predates the technology required to create it? Across mountains, deserts, oceans, and places hidden beneath the surface of the earth, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. These objects were not found in cities, not in places shaped by human activity. They were found where no one was supposed to look, where access is difficult or deliberately restricted, where the environment itself acts as a barrier, where discovery feels less like chance and more like intrusion. And yet, despite the differences between each location, the similarities remain. Precision, intent, placement, as if each object was exactly where it needed to be. Not lost, not abandoned, but positioned, which raises a possibility that becomes harder to dismiss the longer you think about it. What if these objects were never hidden from us, but placed in locations where we simply weren't expected to reach? Because if that's true, then discovering them wasn't part of the plan. And maybe the real question isn't what these objects are, but what happens now that we've started finding them.